I am as keen as anyone else. But to accuse the Prime Minister and to expect the Prime Minister to interfere with the decision of AG, whatever that may be, I think, the public also has to be fair to the government.
I'm Wong Xiaoning and this is the Breakfast Grille. The midterm review of the 12th Malaysia Plan is an ambitious one and part of the wider economy Madani framework. Now, with only 2 years left ticking on the clock of this 12 MP, bold and innovative actions are supposed to be taken to improve the well-being of Malaysians and the economy. Interestingly too, the government recognises the need to regain trust by ensuring good governance. Now, all these are lofty and worthy goals, but are they achievable? Economy Minister Rafizi Ramli joins us to make his case. Thank you for coming on the show again. I think you win the medal for the fastest ever repeat guest. But we do appreciate it when ministers want to explain their agenda and be accountable for it. But let's turn things slightly around and start with politics. I promise we will come back to the 12 MP. So first off, was the outcome of the twin elections in Johor a huge sigh of relief for Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim and Pakatan Harapan?
No, I think the result in Johor was expected that we would be able to keep both seats. I was pleasantly surprised because of the margin. With that kind of margin and very low turnout rates for both seats, below 60%, it did mean that we won the Malay votes.
Okay.
So it's Johor voters, as with many urban and semi-urban voters, are very different from the Malay belt voters.
But when I did a little bit of digging and looked at the majority, the assumption was that the majority would even be higher because there was supposed to be vote transfer from BN supporters. So some of the political analysts say that the outcome maybe not so positive for PH, although some would say, you might take it as a point of view that the voters there care less about Datuk Sri Zahid Hamidi's discharge not amounting to an acquittal. So nonetheless, is it a bit of still a wake-up call within the party though?
No, it was expected that the vote transfer between different states will be different. And I've always said that it's not 1 + 1 = 2. But certainly with the kind of with the kind of results we had in the 2 seats, it meant that the vote transfer from BN to PH and vice versa would have been double than what we saw in PRN.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to stay on this DNAA of Datuk Sri Zahid. I mean, yes, your boss, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, has repeatedly denied interference in this case, but there's just a string of coincidences that cannot be explained, at least to me or, to some of our listeners. So we had the former lead prosecutor go on early retirement, paving the way for the application. Then the previous AG then goes on leave ahead of his retirement, leaving the Solicitor General to act in that role. So we wonder what's going on, especially since the Prime Minister still controls the AG's chamber. So can you blame those that believe that, that something's going on behind the scenes and politics is involved in this?
If you are in Datuk Sri Anwar's position, or in fact, for that matter, any Prime Minister's decision, I think the public has to be fair.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, we don't want any interference. On the other hand, we want them to interfere. So the final result of any decision is basically AG's. And it just so happened that AG's extension will end by end of August. It is within his right to get his leave prior to retirement, and everyone does that. The fact that he decided to give decisions on all this, if you are Datuk Sri Anwar, do you tell him to do otherwise? Because by doing so, it means an interference. But when he had decided for the DNAA and Datuk Sri Anwar didn't interfere, and then now, the public says that there was an interference. Likewise, some of the decisions, including Bumiputra, for example, those are the court's decision. So we are in a bind either way.
Court decision based on what the AG recommended, though. But okay, which is there is a difference.
The Bumiputra's decision was court's decision,
yes,
because the prosecution appealed and the judge disagree.
Okay, but let's go back to
this. So we
this.
have to get our facts right.
Let's go back to this AG. Do you think though that we are right to ask for a clearer explanation as regards to what happened?
Yes, I do understand that. I mean, I would have wanted a clearer explanation. We did ask the Prime Minister for an explanation.
Yes.
And in fact, the Parliament will summon the two AGs for an explanation. But
will the public eventually find out what happened? At least a clarity in terms of why the decision was made, the timeline and all that?
The timeline was quite straightforward, I suppose, because the previous AG's term expired end of August.
Okay.
So anyone in his position would want to clear his conscience and decide on all these controversial cases before he passed it to the new AG. Because if I were the new AG, I don't want to carry on whatever that would have been decided, should have been decided by my predecessor. So the timing was unfortunate, to be frank. But there was no interference. And I'm sure the fact that Prime Minister did not stop, for example, mine from talking, did not stop the cabinet from... Hang on, let me finish.
Okay.
The fact that the Prime Minister did not stop the discussion at the cabinet asking for explanation, the fact that the Prime Minister did not interfere with our party leaders asking to summon the two AGs to Parliament, I mean, to me, that is a clear proof, and the public will find out, and let's find out from the two AGs. I am as keen as anyone else. But to accuse the Prime Minister and to expect the Prime Minister to interfere with the decision of AG, whatever that may be, I think, the public also has to be fair to the government.
So there's definitely no gag order on this matter.
There's no gag order.
And there was no instructions to close ranks within the party because there's pretty much been silence from all Harapan MPs. It's almost deafening. Nobody seems to have said anything about this matter.
Well, because once you are in a government and you know you have rooms to demand and to summon officers, we'll follow through the process. And the process, the best process for the time being, is to call these two AGs to the Parliament.
Okay.
And what the government can do is to focus on the reforms. And that's why we are expediting the separation between the prosecutorial power and the AG that acts as government's lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, that news came out yesterday, right, with Law Minister Datuk Sri Azalina. But with this, DNAA, and then the subsequent acquittal of Datuk Sri Bumiputra. And of course, yesterday we had the withdrawal of all charges against Datuk Sri Najib to strike out, the Court of Appeal decided to strike out the prosecution's move to initiate an appeal against him on charges of abuse of power involving a tampering of 1MDB report after the prosecution failed to file their petition of appeals within the time required. Now, all these events brings to mind whether it would be implausible to think that any additional charges against Najib will be dropped and eventually a pardon might be granted to him.
I don't know, to be frank, and I think we will cross the bridge when we are there. But at the same time, I think we also need to give some credits to the judiciary and our court system. You notice I don't necessarily comment, even before when I was in opposition, comment on every single case. Because
although you've had some cases against you personally in the past, right?
And I went through the court.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have suffered some form of injustice.
Let me finish. I mean, you can't keep on cutting me off. That's not fair. We only have 10 minutes. We are supposed to talk about the economic plan.
We will, please.
And you keep cutting me off. So let me explain. Every case has its own merits in court. I went through 14 cases. I know the strength of every single one. I know some cases from legal perspective is weaker than the others. And I would imagine with all these cases brought against anyone, it has different legal merits. So that's why in the past, I don't necessarily comment on every single case of every single person.
Okay.
Because I know some cases have bigger and better legal merit. So I prefer to leave to the court and to the prosecutors to do their work. What we committed before was not to interfere.
Okay. But when it comes to the pardon of Datuk Sri Najib, let's say we get to that bridge, is it a line that Pakatan Harapan will not cross?
We will discuss it at Kerajaan Perpaduan. We will discuss it at Cabinet. But I think it's given that Pakatan Harapan will not agree to it.
Okay, and you're not concerned that, with this recent incidences, that the party has lost its credentials as a party of reform and that does not tolerate corruption? I mean, it's kind of ironic when the Reformasi movement just had its 25th anniversary.
Not true. I mean, these questions BFM has asked every single time for the last 5-6 years. We did win. We did push reform, bits and pieces. I accept the fact that the public, including the media, will ask questions from time to time because when we do reforms, it's expected of us.
Yes.
When our reform does not meet the kind of expectation from the media and the public or the pace, or because it didn't go the extent of some groups of people wanted, then reformasi sudah mati. So it's expected of us. What is important is to stay focused. And eventually, reform does not happen in one day. It's built upon step by step, one by one. And in doing so is a delicate balance because we have seen what happened with PH 1.0. And if anything, the mistake of PH 1.0 is paying too much attention to the demands of so many noisy groups out there.
Rafizi, 12 Malaysia Plan, one that had its origins when Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin was the Prime Minister, introduced then by the Datuk Sri Ismail Sabri and now implemented by Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim. So how does it sit and how is it part of the economy Madani framework and vision, and does it need to be realigned then?
We had to do a lot of almost a complete revision, basically. Not so much because there was a change of government. Of course, there was a need to realign to economy Madani framework. But I think what was more important was everything had changed because of COVID and because of the global challenges, including the disruption to the supply chain, including the slowing down of the economy. So it was as good as a new document altogether.
Okay. But I did notice, one of the biggest shifts was the revision of the three themes, right? So you've got sustainable, prosperous and high-income nations, which is great because it moves away from this old-school development economics. Was that something that was decided at the onset that it was going to be driven very differently?
Yes, because when we came in, the priorities. The diagnosis was very clear.
Yeah.
It's not great. We know that financially, the public finances have to be reformed radically because it's not sustainable. So fiscal consolidation and financial sustainability was key. We also know that we need a new growth narrative because the kind of growth engines, while it has kept the country up to this point, it will not be able to entice new investments or quality investments into the kind of industries that we want, the kind of high growth, high value industries. And the third, we understand the talent crunch. We know that if we don't do something, you can plan whatever, but we will always have shortfalls going forward. So it began with the diagnosis from the outset.
Okay, one thing I did notice is the upward revision of GDP growth, right? So the headline is now 5 to 6% from the original target, 4.5 to 5.5%. But you yourself noted that the economy is slowing down, external headwinds exist. So where is this growth really going to come from? Is it going to be private sector driven? And when it comes to private sector driven, some would say it's been sluggish in the last few years because of confidence. It's not like Malaysian companies and don't have money, but they just don't want to reinvest.
Correct. Basically, we have a lot of capitals, not just domestic capital, but international funds are going around. It's just Malaysia has been bypassed from time to time. There's also a concern about domestic investment. So you are right that it's very much about confidence. It is also about stability. But as importantly, it is about the narrative. We tested with Netta, for example. And that was the reason why Netta was launched first. We wanted to validate this idea that if we align our growth narrative with the flavor and the focus of the world,
new economy,
and we have a good plan, and we demonstrate our commitment to it, we would be able to entice local and foreign investments. And to a certain extent, Netta validated that. So it's very much about selling and convincing first the growth narrative, but on our part is to understand that there have to be a lot of debottlenecks in public sectors that we have to do, and that's exactly what is in the midterm review.
Okay, I've also noticed that 15 billion ringgit has been added to the 400 billion development expenditure. We've got 90 billion to spend annually till 2025, but where is this money going to come from, since there is this commitment and to reduce the fiscal deficit to 3% by 2025? It's a tall order, a lot of moving parts.
We will be able to have extra 15 billion to allocate for development expenditure, provided we grow in the region of 4 to 5% in 2024 and 2025. And at the same time, we carry on with important fiscal consolidation exercise. And of course, that the major chunk of it is a subsidy retargeting. So with refocus on getting the best value out of development expenditure and operating expenditure as before, we will be able to save 15 billion. And that's the decision that this 15 billion should be plowed back into development expenditure.
Okay, I'm going to sound like a broken record because I asked you this 1.5 months ago, and it's the targeted subsidy. Is there a timeline for its rollout? I mean, after all, this 12 MP midterm report, there is going to have this pangkalan data utama padu, right? So I think that's going to happen. So seems like all the pieces of the jigsaw are in place. What's stopping the government from targeted subsidies?
It's certainly in 2024.
Okay.
The debate in the government now is on two issues. First, when? Is it first quarter? Is it second quarter? Is it third quarter? Second is how sharp.
Okay.
Then and I think the decision will be made in due course. But I will tell that it's actually either first or second quarter of 2024. Most likely it will be from second quarter onwards, because we have one task to deliver. Our households, the data for our households are incomplete as it is as we have now, because out of about 16 million workforce that we have, about 6 million are in the informal sector. So the government doesn't have any record from them apart from the household record, which is their name, their children, and so on. But we don't have income record. So in order to complete Padu, we do need to open Padu to the public to validate.
And that will happen soon, right?
That will happen in January. So either way, we have to complete that exercise first. That's why, there's one school of thought in government who feel that we really need to be confident with the completeness of our data. Then we can do subsidiary targeting.
Now, Rafizi, I want to talk about this midterm review from the perspective of governance, because I see a whole host of legislative changes planned, from some under exploration like Anti-Rank Seeking Act to those that will be enacted like the Government Procurement Act, Fiscal Responsibility Act and the Political Donation Act. Now, will there be enough political will to push these much needed reforms through, especially since the unity government just lost its 2/3 majority with the exit of Syed Saddiq.
All these laws don't require 2/3 majority, so I don't think we will have any problem passing it through. And I don't think Syed Saddiq dare to vote against such laws if ever it comes to Parliament. Likewise, so far, I know that perhaps it's quite difficult for the public to grapple with this, but the cabinet is whole when it comes to reform.
No voices of dissent.
No voices of dissent, and that's why it was very quiet, and then we would be able to list down and give our commitment. So my concern is actually not on the political will, because that decision has been made. These are the laws that we're going to enact. It's about whether the processes can be carried out in time, because in the past it did take quite a while to enact a law,
and it can't be expedited in any way.
We have to figure out how to expedite it, because in the past it takes at least 2 to 3 years for one law. Sometimes it takes about 4 to 5 years,
and before that there might be a new government. Yes.
And so that should be the focus, is how exactly are we going to complete the process from all the stakeholders, management, and then the drafting, and then slotting it in Parliament, because even now, there is a long queue of legislation to go to Parliament. So all this has to be taken into account. So it's not so much about political will, it's about managing the time to deliver to our commitment.
Okay, and I want to talk about the third theme of this 12 MP midterm review, which is the high-income nation. And what caught my eye, of course, is the focus on the 5 potential sectors. Some of them are obvious, like E&E, renewable energy, technology. They're already referred to in, the National Energy Transition Roadmap and the National Industrial Master Plan. But the one that stood out is rare earths. Why the focus on this?
I think the public doesn't know that we have among the most significant rare earth deposits, not just in this region, but on this far side of the world.
Okay.
And in the last 9 months, certain things had happened. So, for example, in all our communication and discussion with our foreign trading partners, the big ones, the Western Bloc, China and other blocs, one of the biggest leverage that we've had is always the focus on our REE potentials. So it was quite obvious that REE is an unknown potential of our economy so far. That's number one. Number two, some states have completed basically mapping their minerals, and different states have estimated their rare earth mineral potentials, and it's huge. It went all the way to trillions in the next 10-20 years. So the challenge then is not so much about understanding that this is something that is significant to our economy. The challenge is how to develop it in such a way that we balance between its humongous benefit to the economy with the risk and the cost that we have to pay. And it is also aligned with some of other HGHV's focus. For example, we want to lead in EV, in energy transition, in electronics.
Yeah.
All these are tied to rare earth.
But my problem here, or my struggle here, is the fact that what comes first, because rare earths is, in some circles will say, it's a very polluting industry. But yet this government wants to have environmental credentials. So what is the priority here? Because you can have a national mineral policy, which I think the government's going to come up with, to do so in a sustainable and responsible manner. But, so far our track record for that isn't great. So what's the focus going to be on, Rafizi?
Actually, we were at the same junction more or less about 40, 50 years back, when we started with our oil and gas development. It was alien to us. It was considered very high-end, technology-wise, and very capital-intensive. To our forefathers' credit, they managed to structure the oil and gas development in this country in such a way that we did balance all.
Okay.
And with that aspiration, we hope to be able to emulate and do the same. The challenge is that everything has to happen quickly and at the same time.
But one question I have is minerals. Currently, some of it's under state. Will it all be put under federal then?
No,
because otherwise, how are you going to control it?
That's why.
That's the problem with land also issues in Malaysia, isn't it?
It will remain under state's jurisdiction, because otherwise we have to go to Parliament to amend the constitution. And certainly some states will never agree to it. So I think it's a no-go from the very beginning. But the state only regulates access to and licensing of exploration. Everything else is under federal jurisdiction, including exports, including permits, and so on. So this is where if we leave it as it is, what will happen is that there'll be theft, there'll be irresponsible mining, and then our raw rare earth minerals will be just smuggled to overseas. So that's why we need to very quickly put the whole industry together. And I'm not too concerned about investments, because part of the reason why we acknowledge this is because of the huge interest of high-end investors from all over the world about coming into Malaysia. But, I don't want to do it piecemeal. I actually want to see the whole 30, 40 years plan, and we want to make sure that as much value is kept in this country.
Okay, while keeping the environment.
Yes.
Okay. I have a question about taxes. Not very popular, but we need it to happen, tax reform. And we also need the widening of the base. Does this mean two things? GST, is it back on the radar? And also, can you help us clarify the capital gains tax that you referenced? Starting with GST, when is it happening? 2024, 2025?
The discussion is about widening the tax base, and the focus is on indirect taxes. Whether it's GST or whether it's improving the existing SST regime, that is still under consideration, because SST collection now, I think easily surpassed 20 billion plus. And in a few years' time, it's going to be more or less the same with what was collected of GST.
Well, that's also because our economy has grown technically.
Yeah. But this is another philosophy that we discuss, is that I don't think the government wants to tax for the sake of just having more money. We want to see what is the optimal spending in the next 5-10 years and get the best value, and then you keep the tax as minimal as possible
to encourage.
I rather the money is kept in the business rather than. So in that sense, we don't want to take it so academically that this is the most efficient tax, it can collect the fastest and most money. But there is one agreement. The agreement is that we need to widen the revenue base. And the best way to do it is to look at indirect taxes. How exactly we want to do it, I think in due time, we will make that decision.
Maybe budget 2024.
And on capital gains tax, it is not on quoted shares. So I know a lot of people were talking about how is this going to affect my portfolios. The capital gains tax discussion so far is on unquoted shares. Because the largest of transactions of the highest value in this country so far, more or less, are on unquoted shares, not on quoted shares.
Okay, another agenda within the midterm review of the 12 MP that caught my eye is this so-called review of the Bumiputra Empowerment agenda, which is focused so far, I think, in this country on equity ownership, which never reached 30% after 50 years. So does this mean that the NEP, which technically has ended but still continues in one form or another, will be reviewed?
I don't think we want to talk about NEP because officially it has ended.
Yeah.
Even my generation, and I'm not considered young nowadays, actually hardly make reference to NEP as a Malay, as Bumiputra, But we do have a problem. Bumiputra forms the majority.
Yes.
And increasingly, Bumiputra is the biggest professional group. It is also the biggest SME group, micro SME group. And therefore, they are very significant to our economy. What we see now is the value multiplication from scaling up of Bumiputra SMEs is lower. And therefore, we have to figure out how to create more value-creating Bumiputra SMEs. Likewise, the result of the EB, when it comes to restructuring economic mobility for Bumiputra in the past, I think we have to take our hats off. But the unintended consequences was that instead of creating businessmen, it creates professionals who makan gaji. So
we had a few businessmen who benefited.
Those are quite, that model most probably didn't work, But compared to, say, Chinese or Indians, a lot of the focus and energy was on building enterprises that eventually creates value. Whereas you have as qualified, or more often than not, more qualified Bumiputra, chartered accountants for that matter, we have a lot, but they prefer to stay in employment, looking for, steady income. And therefore, I do feel that there's a big gap because it's of a missed opportunity of creating value. So when we talk about Bumiputra's empowerment, this administration perspective is not really about creating a few millionaires. It is about realigning the expertise and contribution of Bumiputra professionals and enterprises to be able to scale up and create value for SMEs so that their contribution can expedite our growth. Therefore, the pivot is this. The pivot is to convince more Bumiputra professionals and enterprises to take risks, to go through the pain points of building a business, and to take a long-term view that it is okay to go through challenges in the beginning. Despite how qualified you are, it is better to create value through enterprises rather than going for all these top GLC posts.
Ooh. Some people in GLC might be a bit nervous today. But anyway, okay, Rafizi, I know that equity markets and ringgit aren't the only or maybe the best barometers of an economy, but still very important and extremely visible. So the FBM KLCI hasn't ever really recovered from the 1998 financial crisis. 3-year returns, negative 2.5%. 5-year returns, 19% down. 10 years, down 18%. So who wants to invest in Malaysia or Bursa Malaysia? While the ringgit down 13% for 3 and 5-year periods and then 49% for 10 years against the US dollar. So just adding to this sense of despair, like, what's going on, Is that all going to change with this Madani government?
I think it's easier to manage our equity market because it was clear why it was not as enticing to foreign portfolio fund managers. Is because we were stuck in the old economy, so to speak. Hence why Nectar was the first of many to come in
also
order
because
to
GLCs
realign.
weren't performing.
Yeah, but the direction and signalling must come from the government. Now that the government made it very clear that energy transition and therefore green compliance is very important, at least it is aligned with the foreign portfolio managers' requirements. So I think as we roll out sectoral reform and as we push more of our counters to focus on areas that we think are aligned to the aspiration of foreign managers, foreign portfolio managers' requirement, then I think we will see a steady recovery over the next 3 to 4 years. So, equity market is easier, I suppose. Ringgit is very difficult because it's a global phenomenon. And as much as ringgit continues to be hammered, that problem is not unique to us. In fact, the two biggest victims of, how currency now is traded is China and Japan. Japan's yen, I think, has devalued
10% on a year-to-date basis, but their market's up 25%.
Yeah, but I think over a longer period is even worse than that. So what countries are seeing now is that the value of their currency is quite detached from their fundamentals, and it's not just unique to us. It's unique to is happening all over the world.
But would you not think if there was a restoration of confidence, that we had all the pieces of the jigsaw right, and Malaysia was a bright spot, and there was a lot of FDI, our ringgit might one day recover? Because, you won't see outflow, even from Malaysians themselves.
Take Singapore, for example, right? If that hypothesis is spot on, that it works perfectly and is totally reflective of the economy. Take Singapore with all its robustness. It has spent about $30 billion plus just to maintain the value of its currency.
Well, they do use currency as a hedge against inflation. They don't use interest rates, right? So their economic model is slightly different.
But in doing so, it means that they have intervened in the market at the cost of about $30 billion to keep it and to strengthen. And imagine if Malaysia does the same. Imagine if other countries does the same. So what we see is that increasingly more and more countries are finding it difficult to manage its own internal policy rates, its internal or domestic economic policies because of the rate differentials. And because of the rate differentials alone, it can move capitals rapidly on month-to-month, even week-to-week basis. So I know that this is a global problem.
Yes.
It is something that I think the government has to address. So the next focus is really to see how we can work together with Bank Negara and all the agencies and the market to see what is the best ways to manage this. But I do acknowledge that irrespective of everything else, the prerequisites are the same. We have to bring back the confidence. We have to give a good growth narrative. And I think in due time, the next 1 year, we have better confidence. But at the same time, we also have to address that so that when our fundamentals are much stronger, that should be reflected in our ringgit, which is actually very undervalued now.
Do I dare ask you, do you have a fair value for the ringgit?
Let's talk with Bank Negara and others. I have my opinion, but I'm not the central banker, so we'll go through that process.
On that note, thank you for your time today on the Breakfast Grille. Was Rafizi Ramli, Economy Minister. I'm Wong Xiaoning, BFM 89.9.